You are listening to Start a Movement with Your Message with Hannah Power, delving deep into personal branding and the mindset needed to become a powerful online leader, with a mission to inspire you and give you the tools to step into your light and have the courage to start a movement with your message. Hello everybody, welcome to episode number 19 of Start a Movement with Your Message. Today I am joined by the wonderful Lou Hamilton. Hello Lou.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's good to see you.
Lou is an expert in podcast guesting and runs Silk Studios, a podcast guesting agency, as well as her very own podcast, Brave New Girl, and is also a BAFTA filmmaker, which I'm guessing we'll hear more about shortly. Her new book, Dare to Share, launches mid-October, which talks all about how to build your brand through the power of podcast guesting. So a podcast expert with her own podcast coming onto my podcast, which makes me feel like a lot of pressure to make this a good episode. So Lou, thank you so much for joining. So obviously, first question that I always like to start with, what is your message?
Yeah, my message is that your story is your differentiator. It's what sets you apart. It's what makes you stand out. It's you. It's why you came to be doing what you are doing. And so if somebody is looking for somebody in your field, you know, probably most people are going to be solving a problem or serving a need in some way or another. So you need something that is going to help you to feel like, yeah, this person really resonates with me. Something in their story really resonates with me, and something in what has happened to them and why they've come to do what they're doing is really powerful. And so, for example, I first heard you on the Sandro Forte podcast, right. And I heard your story, and then I heard you on Clubhouse, and then I reached out to you, read your book, you came on my podcast, and you know, who knows what happens in the future, we might work together. So you know, when somebody shows up in different places with different aspects of their story, you start to understand what they're about and why they're doing what they're doing. So, you know, so now I know that what your thing is personal branding. So if I know somebody that needs to have personal branding, you're going to be the person that I recommend, because I understand who you are and what you're about. And so I think that the power of your voice, the power of your story, is what will hook people in, the right people, into your world.
Mm-hmm. It's really cool. And what I think is really cool about you, as in terms of with my personal branding hat on, is how niched you are, like how much you've owned this niche of podcast guesting. So obviously it's much broader than that. You've just given the example of storytelling and all of these things, and building your brand and being an expert in your space and stuff. But your niche of what you do is around this space of podcast guesting. And I want to cover that in more detail, because I know we've spoken before about podcast guesting being the new PR, one of the new PR angles that people can take. But before we get there, I know you've had quite a winding road of a journey, you know, lots of highs, lots of lows. So I'd love to hear about why that's your message. What's led you to this point? What's your story?
Yeah, I really love podcast guesting. And I think it's because as a child, and, you know, when I was young, I was very, very shy and an introvert. I still am an introvert, but I'm not so shy. For instance, I would never, ever have been able to do this. I would never have been able to come on a podcast and speak out. And so I think that the power of the voice is something that has always really mattered to me, because I felt that I didn't have a voice. And so when I was in my 20s and I was doing an MA in public art, we created a performance around, well, it was called Silent Voices, and it was around reclaiming the streets. Well, this was, you know, back in the 90s, and, you know, it was a problem then, it's still a problem now. And so what we did is we sent out, you know, pre-technology, pre-internet, most things. We sent out 400 postcards to women and women's groups around the country, asking for them to write on the back of the postcard the things that they would really want to say but haven't felt able to. And with those words, we we had a performance in the Union Chapel in Islington, beautiful space, and we hung up 2 massive screens and projected 2 giant mouths, and out of the mouths came the words of these women, and created a whole performance around it. And so, you know, as the years went on, I got into documentary filmmaking, and I was always really fascinated by people's stories. And one of the documentaries, it was a documentary series that we did about terminal illness called Death. And one of the women, all of the stories were amazing, but one of the women had Crohn's disease. And when the episode aired on Channel 4, people were so moved by her story that they sent money in for her, because she'd had these terrible wounds that weren't healing. And when we first started to film her, she'd been on this medication. It was like a trial for 3 months, and her wounds started to heal, and she'd stopped being in pain. And then, because it was postcode lottery, she wasn't able to continue the medication, and immediately the wounds opened up again, and she returned to being in terrible pain. You know, she had you know, a young family, and you know, it was really heartbreaking. She was a very strong, amazing woman, and you know, we hadn't said send in money, but at the end of the episode, people just started sending money in to us. And so we set up a trust for her, and a couple of years later I bumped into her consultant, and I said, oh, you know, how's she doing? And he said, well, you know, the trust, there was enough money for her to have that medication for the rest of her life. And that moved me so massively that I thought, you know, this is, creativity has the power to, and storytelling has the power to change lives and to really make a difference. And so that sort of became my mission, really, in whatever I was doing, whether that was film at that time and documentaries. And then as sort of my children were growing up and leaving home, I was beginning to feel more and more frustrated with documentary making, because, you know, most of the time is spent trying to get films off the ground and trying to raise the money and feeling less and less creative. And so when I turned 50, you know, my kids were leaving, my grandmother had died, and I just thought, you know, what now? And I suddenly had this kind of urge to start drawing again, and out popped this character that later became known as Brave New Girl. And I sort of posted her on social media, and this kind of before the whole meme thing came out, that started happening, and people were saying, oh, we want more of her. And so I just kept posting her, and then someone said, oh, you need to do a book. So I got an agent, and it came out as a book. And then I wrote a self-help book called Fearless, following the first book, which was Brave New Girl, How to Be Fearless. And I just felt like, you know, this character sort of had more legs, and so sort of put her on T-shirts. And then when my first book had come out, my agent had said to me, oh, we really must get you on podcast to promote your book. And I didn't even know what a podcast was. This was, you know, I think we were quite behind in the UK. And anyway, so roll on a few years, and I started to think, you know, actually, wouldn't that be amazing to have real life brave new girls come onto a podcast and talk about how they have found courage in all of the sort of messiness of life and work. And so I started the podcast, and as I was doing that, originally it was a live event with an audience Q&A, which was great. But then, of course, the pandemic happened, and so we had to take it online, which was the best thing, because it meant that I could interview women all around the world. And I just thought, you know, here I am, I've got these women, I can do 52 women a year, but how about trying to get to try and help even more women get on podcasts? And so that was how the idea of the podcast guest agency came. So it really sort of, I think, as a result of the technology and everything that had happened to me, going back to that kind of very first thought of, you know, silent voices, how can we give women a platform for their message, for their story, for the things that they want to share, for their sort of ups and downs and the lessons they've learned. So it was because technology had sort of suddenly created a platform for me to be able to do that in a completely different way. So yeah, that's how it came about.
Love that, and a very well told story. How did you go about crafting your story in that way? So obviously I know that's part of what you work with people to do, and actually I also do, and then I had Nick on recently as well, who is a story, actually that episode might be coming out later on, I can't remember when I've recorded it now, but who helps people to tell their stories. How did you go about reflecting and going, well, that, you know, because I was like that, now I'm here? What was that journey of actually creating that story like?
Well, yes, it was sort of because I knew that I was going to start going on podcasts. It gave me a chance to sort of look back, and, you know, hindsight's a great thing, and the way that you can kind of draw the line between the dots as you sort of look back. And actually, even when I've been on podcasts and a story is sort of a section of my story has suddenly popped out, and I've just gone, oh, gosh, actually, I understand now why that bit is relevant and why that is so powerful. And I didn't make the connection about the that performance, Silent Voices, and the podcast guest agency until I was writing this book, Dare to Share. And I suddenly realized, yeah, this is why it feels so powerful to me to be doing the guest agency, is because I've always believed in giving women a voice, or helping women have a voice, and put it out there in some way or another. And so, you know, because I'd been thinking about, you know, why is this brand, why would anyone, you know, come to this brand as opposed to another brand, and why am I doing it, and why is it so important to me? And so it was, you know, that bit of my story that just made me think, oh, that's it, that's why it's so important. And you know, the fact that, you know, I was a shy child, that's why it's so important, is because, you know, I didn't feel I had a voice, because I didn't feel that I could speak out. And so it makes, you know, and you know, when you're lacking in something, you know, it makes you want to sort of either create that for yourself or help create it for other people. And you know, something when you came on Brave New Girl podcast was that you talked about your cousin dying was a really sort of powerful moment for you, lots of kind of realizations for you. And I didn't say it at the time, but it really struck a chord for me, because my cousin, who I was also incredibly close to, there was only 3 months between us. She died when we were about the same age as you were. Wow. And yeah, and I do feel that her loss made me feel, well, you know, she didn't get to have a life, so I've got to A, really make the most of mine, and B, help others to really make the most of theirs. And so it's all of those things that I think that have happened in our past that sort of help feed our reasons for doing the things that we do. And you know, why would I pick a podcast guest agency to build as a business, you know, at the age of 57? Why that? Why then? And why is that important to me? Why is it so important to me? And it's because of the things that have happened through my story.
So let's talk about podcast guesting. So, because obviously, you know, the world is constantly changing, and I think what's been really interesting in this, like, having watched the world change in the sort of, I guess, the sort of 20-ish years of my life, because, well, I'm 29, but as in 20 years consciously sort of understanding roughly about online marketing and stuff. You know, it started with, everything was about, you know, get into the traditional media. And then social media came out, and it was like, you know, this makes people more accessible. But then really it was just about, okay, so now non-famous people can get famous through social media, and they still want to get over to the traditional media. And even now, with a lot of clients that I have, you know, the ultimate goal is to get into the Telegraph or Forbes or whatever, the very traditional media outlets. Whereas what we know is that those kinds of places are actually less and less the kind of content that people are consuming, and more they're consuming content from regular people. And then we've seen the rise of micro influencers, and we've really seen a change of how you promote yourself and how you get yourself out in front of people. And I use the word promote. I don't really like that word because I think it sounds really egotistical, but at the end of the day, if you've got something you want to say and you want people to hear, you have to get that out in some way. So podcast guesting is one of the newer things into the PR world, isn't it? Featuring on people's podcasts, and more people. I mean, I saw the other day that like so many people from like Love Island, Made in Chelsea, like all of these kind of shows have now all got podcasts. You know, so many people now have got podcasts. So podcast guesting, is it a whole PR strategy? Is it PR? Is it brand building? Is it content? Where does it fit in the overall ecosystem of this crazy online world that we're all trying to navigate? Even people that are experts in it struggle to really know where everything sits. Can you give me a little bit of context on podcast guesting and what that actually means?
Well, I think it does fit in as part of the whole strategy. So, you know, you're still going to want to try and get into magazines and newspapers and onto TV if you can. You're still going to need to do your social media, but it's just another way of getting your story and your brand, your visibility, you know, out there and to sort of give an impact to the world. But it's actually, you know, yes, it's a new technology, but it's actually an ancient form of communication, isn't it? Having a conversation. It's what we've done ever since we were in caves. We sat around the campfire and we told our stories. And when someone tells their story, it helps you to think about yours and to reflect on yours and what's happened to you. And so I think that's why it's been so phenomenally successful, is because both for the person that comes on to the podcast, but also for the listener, I think that, you know, we sort of can get addicted to kind of hearing other people's stories, and it's because it's so powerful. And, you know, it's a very intimate conversation. It's between two people, but as a listener, you get to kind of get to know those people. You know, where else do you get 30 to 40 minutes to hear someone's story, or for the person that's telling it to tell your story? And, you know, people both like to talk about what they do and what's meaningful to them and impactful to them. And people also like to listen to that. You know, we love conversation. You know, it's a very human need. You know, we know the devastating impact of the pandemic, in that, you know, so many people have been incredibly lonely because they haven't had people to communicate with us. And also the kind of massive rise of Zoom and you know, and of podcasts. You know, when I started writing my book at the beginning of the pandemic, when there was 1 million podcasts, by the time I'd finished a year later, there were 2 million podcasts.
Wow, really?
You know, so yeah, so it, you know, and there's probably even more than that now. And, you know, so it's growing exponentially, and that's because it answers a need. It answers an emotional need, and it answers our need as humans to connect and communicate and contribute.
It's also quite a nice type of content, you know, obviously doing what I do and being someone that works with people to grow their brands. I like to try out all the types of content before I say to my clients, yes, you should do this, or I can help you to do this. And podcasting, you know, I've done blogs and videos and social media and blah, blah, blah. But I hadn't, you know, I thought, oh, I'll give podcasting a go. And, you know, I would like to interview people. And, you know, it wasn't just to try it. It was also that I would like to actually bring my message in that way. But in terms of as a type of content, it feels slightly more natural than some of the other types. You know, sitting and recording a video, talking to a camera, that is quite an intense experience, even if you enjoy doing it. Whereas having a conversation like you and I are having right now is slightly more relaxed, isn't it, in terms of a way of creating content?
Also, if you compare it to public speaking, you know, it was no accident that I called it Dare to Share, because, you know, a huge amount of people wouldn't be able to do public speaking because they're too introverted or too shy. Whereas suddenly, you know, this has opened up a whole world for those people, as well as for the people that were on speaking on stage. You know, it's much more intimidating to stand in front of an audience of 200 people, whereas, you know, you can have a conversation with one other person, but with millions of people listening. But as the speaker, as the guest, you're not aware of all those people listening. So it still just feels like a conversation. And so I think it makes it much more democratic.
I still find it weird to think that people actually like watch my content, and like when people say I was watching your videos, I feel like, oh my god, I feel like they've just seen me naked. Do you know what I mean? Like I had a call with someone earlier, and she was like, it was a prospect, she did become a client, and she said, you know, it was the first call I'd had with her. She was a cold lead, she'd come through my website, and I you know, she said, I said the price, and she said, like, you know, I really want to work with you, I've watched all your videos. And I thought, oh, that's great. Like the videos, you know, are working. The clients, you know, the potential clients knows me and likes me or whatever. And then I suddenly thought, oh my gosh, she's seen all my videos. You know, like I had that like, oh, that's so weird. And I know when I like go on dates and stuff, like I'm always like really aware of like, oh, has this person like looked me up on social media and seen me talking about all this like random stuff on the internet, and they're like on a date with me thinking like, God, this girl talks a lot.
They've got an advantage, haven't they? Mind you, that means that, you know, they know you pretty well, and they're there, they want to date. So yeah, maybe that's the way forward for dating agencies.
Yeah, although this is obviously a bit off topic, but I actually decided on dating apps to take my second name off. So actually, when I go on dates now, I don't give them that opportunity. Not that I'm like that famous, but you know, if you put Hannah Power into Google, you know, there's quite a lot of information about me that comes up, and I started to feel like it was quite unfair, because I was like, they know all this stuff about me and I don't know stuff about them. So I actually and I started to annoy me, because also I'm quite public about quite a lot of the personal stuff that's obviously happened in my life, which I really want to be and really believe in and stuff. But just sometimes when you're going on a date with someone and they know like all that stuff, like it just kind of makes you feel like it's like they're at an unfair advantage, and also it gives you like less to talk about. So I'm trying a different strategy now where I don't give them my second name. But yeah.
Or they've got to have been on a podcast for you to go on a date with them.
Well, yeah, maybe that's my new measure. Maybe that's where I'm going wrong. So talk me through how it works. So obviously when we've had the conversation before, you've mentioned you've got almost like this traffic light system. So there's like different levels of podcasts, and you've got like the gold standard, which is like all the like famous people ones, I'm guessing, and etc. etc. Can you kind of talk me a little bit through roughly how your process works and how you kind of measure and match things?
Yeah, so we have a bit of a ranking system. So, you know, if you've got a social media following of say 3,000 people, you're not going to get on a podcast that has 30 million downloads. So it's sort of not rocket science, but it does take a bit of sort of research to find the level that you're at, and you know the sort of right ranking system. But it, you know, you know, so what we do is we go through someone's story and with them, and all their themes and topics, and all the kind of the sort of variety of things that they could talk about, because what you don't want is, you know, to have your set story that you just churn out from one podcast to another, because that's going to get boring for you and boring for everybody else that follows you. And so you kind of you've broken down your different topics that you can talk about, and then you find, you know, you then research the podcasts that come into those topics, then work out how they rank against you in terms of your social media, your following, your email list. And so you get a sort of pretty good mission match. And then once you've got to establish that, you know, they've still got, you know, if they've had a recent episode, that they're still going, they haven't just kind of pod faded, and that they have guests, because, you know, some don't. And the golden rule is that you listen to the podcast, listen to several of the episodes, so you really get a sense of, you know, what is this podcast is about, what's its DNA, what's the format, is it a style that you like, do you kind of feel like you could get on with the host, Do you really feel that you can offer something to what they're offering to their listeners? Because when you're pitching to a podcast host, the main thing that they're concerned about is that their podcast is going to be better for having you on it, and B, that you're going to be serving their listeners in some way, and they really care about their listeners. It's really, really important to them. So you need to be offering, you need to be telling them what you're going to be offering to their listeners. And so that's part of the pitch is, what you do, why you're an expert, a little bit about your story and what you're offering to the listeners. And, the more that you can show that you've listened to their podcasts and you've listened to specific episodes and show that and talk about that in as kind of few sentences as possible, the more likely that they're going to feel like, oh yeah, this person really understands what we're about, and they will fit in with what we're trying to do. I've had people pitch to me for Brave New Girl podcast, and they plainly haven't listened to the podcast, and they're sort of, it feels just like a CV that they're banging out. So you really have to kind of tailor the pitch to the individual podcast that you're writing to. And I go through all that in the book, and kind of how to craft an email so that so that the podcast host feels like, oh yeah, they really care about being on my podcast. It's not just like, oh, a numbers game, I've got to get up, I need to do so many, and I need to get turn out the emails.
So what stage of somebody's brand journey do you think they can start with looking at podcast guesting? So obviously I know that when you've got a brand, an established brand, like obviously it's a no-brainer, but obviously the bulk of my clients that I work with tend to be really at the beginning of their brand journey. They might have they usually have a very small following, often going through a rebrand anyway, so their following might not even be relevant necessarily. When is the earliest point that you think somebody could start looking to be a podcast guest? Is there like a minimum criteria for your sort of like bronze level?
Well, you've got a long story. Most people have a long story to getting to where they are to start their brand. And so as they're kind of figuring out their brand, how that story fits in with what they're doing, like I talked about with how I started mine. And, it wasn't that long into creating the podcast guest agency that I thought, well, I need to get on to podcasts. I need to talk about my story. I need to say how I came to be where I am now and why I'm doing what I'm doing and why that's relevant to other people. So I think, when you're thinking about, your presence online, on social media, I think that, podcast guesting is sort of part and parcel of all of that. And as soon as you know what your story is and how it relates to your brand, that's the time to be talking about it.
Really?
And getting out there. And
so you can do it that early on. You don't need to have you don't need to start once you've got a big following. You could literally start straight out the door.
Yeah, because there are so many podcasts that are starting that are desperate for guests.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
They haven't got much of a following. So if you haven't got much of a following, then you're a perfect guest for them. If you fit with, you fit with what they're trying to do with their podcast. So yeah, it's not, while you're, as long as you're aware of what your story is and the kind of trajectory of where you've come from and why you're doing what you're doing. I think it's all part and parcel of of what you do, with personal branding. It's all part and parcel of that, isn't it?
So in your book, in Dare to Share, is that a book that's sort of like a process of how to go about doing this? Is it kind of a step? Oh, it is kind of a manual in where how to go about it.
Yeah. So when I created the guest agency, I was there to sort of, help others to get onto podcasts. And then I thought, well, I can only help so many people, and it's quite expensive to be represented by an agent, and that doesn't sit well with me. I'm all for everybody having access to information. So I thought, well, I'll write a book that tells people exactly everything that I know, and gives them a sort of step-by-step guide to doing it, so they can do it themselves. And so the first half is really, or the first third is about story and about all of the themes and topics. So really working out, this is sort of going back to my documentary and filmmaking background and screenwriting. What makes a story? What are the essential elements in a story that anyone would recognize as, the basic is a beginning and middle and an end, but there's more nuance to that everyone recognizes. If you watched a film, you would know if there was one of those elements that wasn't in there. Mm-hmm. It would feel unsatisfactory. You'd feel like, this story isn't working. And so those basic elements, I take people through to kind of really look at in depth in their story and their kind of timeline and the kind of nuance, the up and down, the roller coaster, the darks, the lights, and the triumphs at the end. And that can start at any point in your story. So you can take this kind of map and plonk it at any point in your timeline. So it might be that on one podcast, my story will start at the point where I turn 50 and grieving and empty nesting and wondering what next to do with my life. So my story could start there, or it could start right back when I'm 20 something and losing my cousin. So it's so you can look at any point of your story, but with this kind of way of kind of taking your story apart, and then we look at the different themes, and that sort of helps you to kind of really do a deep dive that allows you to then think of more themes and more podcasts to get onto that kind of look at what you do in a slightly different way. And then the next 2/3 are about how you research and pitch, and then actually going on a podcast. And then the kind of the most important thing that quite a lot of guests forget about is afterwards. It's the trail that you leave behind, and that's what's going to get people to come into your world. It's your responsibility as a guest to help the podcast host promote that podcast as much as possible. And what's the point of going on a podcast unless you're going to do that? Because otherwise, it's a nice conversation, but the whole point is to gain visibility and impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There's so many, as you're saying it, I'm thinking, God, there's so many steps I bet I miss out, both with my own podcast and when I go onto other people's podcasts. So I really look forward to reading the book. So what's the best way? So this episode is going to come out on September the 7th. So anybody who's listening, happy September the 7th. So it's nearly a month, I guess, until your book launches. Is there a list that we can join, or I can send people to? Because I imagine people listening to this are thinking, actually, I would really like to learn more about this podcast guesting thing. I think it's just such great practice as well for just if you're going to create content, or if you want to be a speaker, what a great way to start. So what's the best way to know when it's out?
Well, so first of all, you can, if you want to sort of get cracking straight away, you can go on my website and sign up for the newsletter, and you get a short course which sort of takes you through the sort of basics of podcast guesting.
And that's your silk-studios.co.uk, yeah? Brilliant.
It,
okay.
Yeah.
That will be in the show notes.
Yeah. And then the book comes out, it'll be on Amazon. I think it's the 14th of October, sort of second week of October. And I've actually got, I'm part of the Other Art Fair, and that weekend. So come along, that's at the Truman Brewery, where some of my artwork is hanging. And I'm also I'm going to use that weekend as the sort of the launch of my book too. So come along and I'll have some copies for you there as well.
Amazing. Okay, that's awesome. Well, all of those links and all of that stuff I'll make sure are below. Lou, thank you so much. I've learnt a lot about this. Actually, it's making me panic. I feel like I need to go and make loads of lists of notes of things I need to do, which is often how I feel. I don't know about you, when I listen to when someone tells you stuff and you're like, I need to work on this instantly. But thank you so much, and congratulations on the new book. And I very, very much, I think we have the same publisher for that, don't we?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
So that's cool. So I really look forward to that coming out. And thank you so much for coming on the episode. So yeah, everybody who's listening, if you'd like to hear more about Lou, everything will be below. And yes, thank you so much, Lou.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's been great to talk to you.